Hello, welcome to a special episode of The World, the Universe and Us from New Scientist. I'm Rowan Hooper.
And I'm Madeleine Cuff. Yes, we've got a special episode today because we're going to solve the climate crisis.
We don't shy away from a challenge at New Scientist. No biggie, but we're not really going to solve it, are we?
Well, we're going to discuss how to feel about it and, potentially how we can fix it as well.
Yeah, we're not going to do that alone. We're joined by two renowned climate scientists. Kate Marvel is a climate scientist in New York. She investigates and promotes science-based solutions to climate change.
And our other guest is Tim Lenton, who's Professor of Climate Change and Earth System Science at the University of Exeter in the UK.
And the reason we've got these two on the show is that both scientists have spent years thinking about and modelling how our planet is going to react and adapt to increasing greenhouse gases. And both have just written books to distill their thinking over the years on this crucial matter. And both books, I think it's fair to say, have a positive message. Kate's book is Human Nature, 9 Ways to Feel About Our Changing Planet.
And Tim's has even got the word positive in the title. His book is called Positive Tipping Points, How to Fix the Climate Crisis. So what we're going to do is talk through some of the findings that you both have made during your work on these books. And hopefully we can come away a bit invigorated about tackling this issue.
Yeah. I thought we'd start with a bit of background from you two. I wondered if there was a sort of origin story. You know, was there a moment where you thought, I need to devote my professional life to working on climate change? Tim, do you want to go first?
Okay, thanks, Rowan. Yeah, I think is the short answer. I mean, it was a bigger thing for me when I was an 18-year-old kid. I read Jim Lovelock's books on the Gaia hypothesis, and I was completely captivated. And I realized that's what I wanted to study, the Earth as a kind of living system. But as soon as we got into that, it was in the midst of a changing climate. Jim Hansen had testified to US Congress. We also had other dimensions of Earth system change, the ozone hole, Amazon forest loss, the whole works. So even back then in the early 1990s, it wasn't just studying it because it was a beautiful, extraordinary system to try and understand. It was, oh my God, what a mess we're making of it. We've got to do something to not get into the existential crisis we've probably slid into in the intervening 30-something years.
Yeah. And Kate, was there such a moment for you?
Yeah, I'm pretty jealous of Tim for figuring it out when he was 18, because when I was 18, I hated science. I thought it was boring. I sat there in physics class and I thought, I do not care about this ball rolling down an inclined plane. Then in college, I took an astronomy class and I was sort of like, oh my God, this is what physics is. If I pay attention in math, I can understand, black holes and the Big Bang. And so I fell in love with science, and I ended up doing a PhD in theoretical cosmology, which is literally the study of the entire universe. And I realized when I was doing that basically all of the other planets out there are just complete garbage. The Earth is the only good place. And so, much later in my career, I had the same realization that Tim did, that this is by far the most fascinating place in the entire universe.
Well, you got there in the end.
It feels like Elon Musk needs a leaf out of your book, Kate, to realise Earth's the place to be.
Oh, don't bring him to it already. But Kate, I thought we'd start with your book. As I said, it's about 9 ways to feel about our changing planet. So 9 emotions we feel about the climate crisis. There's wonder, anger, guilt, fear, grief, surprise, pride, hope and love. Can we start with anger? Because just before we sit down to speak, I saw that BP have announced the biggest discovery of oil and gas they've made in 25 years in a field just off the coast of Brazil. And that made me angry and fearful, actually. So I've got another one in the list. So talk us through how you deal with that.
Yeah, I'm not going to lie to you. The anger chapter was one of the easiest ones to write. But, what I wanted to do in the book is each chapter has kind of a scientific theme and an emotional theme, and then kind of a historical or mythological or story theme. And in the anger chapter, what I wanted to talk about was the history of how we discovered climate change was a thing, how we discovered it was happening. And the thing that makes me really angry about that is that that history of scientists finding stuff out is intertwined with the history of people lying about it. I tell this story of a research group who is trying to establish that most of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the excess carbon dioxide, comes from fossil fuels. And they design these really creative experiments to prove that. They have a large ship that's going around taking measurements of the ocean. And then eventually they develop a climate model that has made extremely accurate projections in retrospect. And you know who did all of that? It was Exxon.
Yeah.
And that does make me very angry. The fact that they knew. This is not something that is a mystery. This is not, the greenhouse effect. This is not new science. We have known about this since the 1800s. So when I see the uncertainty being weaponized, when I see them saying, emphasize what we don't know, I always think, scientists don't know everything, right? But that doesn't mean we know nothing. And that does make me really, really angry and frustrated.
So anger is motivating, though, in this sense, is it?
I hope so. Yeah. I think, it can be really easy to sort of go down a bad path where all you are is angry. I think social media definitely incentivizes this, right? Where, you're just fed more and more outrage, but it's not productive outrage.
Focused outrage we need.
Yeah.
And Tim, how do you get through the day, basically, when you see stuff like that? I mean, I guess we're also talking a bit about doomerism and that sort of side of things. How do you cope with it?
Well, I suspect both of us have faced up to this in our own work. Like, I've been studying climate tipping points that could be really, really bad, really nasty, and arguably some of them are starting to unfold. I mean, we're losing tropical coral reefs that up to 500 million people in the world depend on for their livelihoods. And I've been staring this stuff down for nearly 20 years. So I just found that I had to kind of use the mental toolkit I had of understanding complex systems to try and see if I could find plausible grounds for hope, as my friend Simon Sharp calls it, meaning, could you build a credible case that we could accelerate the change we need to get out of trouble, to the change we need to zero emissions, whether that's behaviors or technologies or, of course, both. And it took me, like, doing the research on the book, Positive Tipping Points, to see that there was the evidence that this is possible, and I wasn't just going to delude myself with a kind of naive hope.
So that's important, isn't it? It's not naive hope. It's rational hope. It's usable hope.
It's or conditional optimism, as somebody called it.
Gritty optimism as well is another one.
I'm optimistic on the basis that some people are going to read the book and some fraction of them will join me in the same journey, which is to say, history teaches us it only needs a fraction of people to change to ultimately tip everyone to change. And we can debate what that critical fraction is. It varies from behavior and technology to norm to norm. But you really don't need everyone to change to ultimately trigger everyone to change.
I guess that's the promising thing when we're thinking about anger as an emotion, because I think what gets me is that, sure, in the 70s when the Exxon scientists were just starting to figure this stuff out, I guess there was some kind of excuse for saying, well, we found this out, but we don't know if we're on the right track. But now it's, the evidence is so overwhelming that there is no excuse for not understanding the risks of exploiting new oil and gas reserves, for example. So it's almost like, how do you get through to people when the weight of evidence itself is not enough? And I guess that argument that maybe we could use this idea of a tipping point to almost like take people along with change that they're not willing to accept themselves is maybe hopeful.
And also the evidence that the number of cases that are being taken to court to force governments or companies to stop trashing the climate or improve their policies is increasing exponentially. It's having its own tipping point, and we've seen the International Court of Justice ruling just recently, very strongly backing a 1.5 degrees C kind of target to limit warming. We've seen the Inter-American Court of Human Rights also say it's a violation of human rights to go out and cross climate tipping points. The further and the faster the law is used and steps up, I think the better weapons we've got on our side of the argument to make the change we need.
Kate, well, in that short clip, we already have been through quite a few emotions there. And Kate, you said that the anger one was one of the easiest ones to write. I feel like you've gone through a lot writing this book, and you've faced all these different emotions head on. And can you talk us through how you process them all? Because in some ways, I felt it was like receiving advice from a therapist. And I mean that in a really positive sense when reading your book.
Ooh, I hope not. I want to be very clear that I am not a therapist. I have no training, and absolutely nobody should listen to me when it comes to like what to do about your emotions. But what I wanted to do is kind of embrace the fact that there is no one way to feel about climate change, right? I was getting really frustrated when I was reading things that were designed to elicit a single emotion, right? Either, just be afraid, or just be angry, or, just be hopeful. And that felt very kind of not very useful to me. And so what I wanted to do is just acknowledge that if you live on planet Earth, like, you have a conflict of interest, like, you care about what happens to this place because everybody that you know lives here. The points that I want to make are: one, I'm not a therapist, don't listen to me. Two, we need to embrace that full spectrum of emotions. And three, that there really is no conflict between being a scientist and having feelings, being a human being. I am not suggesting that we replace the physics of the greenhouse effect with emotions. That is true, no matter how you feel about it. But for a long time, there was this notion that, scientists, we have to be neutral, we have to be objective, we cannot have any feelings. And then I realized that when we pretend we don't feel anything, that doesn't make us more credible, that makes us liars. And I didn't really want to be a liar. So I wanted to write about having emotions. I wanted to write about having a lot of emotions. And I wanted to get a lot of science in there as well.
And speaking as someone who obviously speaks to scientists and then tells the public about what they found and what they say, it's always much more powerful when you kind of hear from a scientist about how they feel about their research as well as what they found. I think it really helps to kind of communicate the message much more impactfully. Yeah,
I agree. I mean, I think scientists just we need to come out as humans. We need to say science is a human activity done by human beings who are flawed but doing their best and have feelings about this place.
Let's circle back to this idea of tipping points that Tim, you've really worked on intensively. So we always introduce you as the tipping points guy on the podcast, but for people who are kind of coming to this idea new, just first off, what are tipping points? And I'm thinking of the scary ones that you talked about first.
Well, tipping points in general are those points or moments where a small change makes a big difference to the state or the fate of some system. They could be good or bad, as we'll discover. But for the bad ones in the climate, we know that there are large parts of the Earth system, major ice sheets, aspects of the ocean circulation, big bits of the biosphere, that have what we call alternative stable states, and that they can be tipped from one state into another. So we could, for example, commit the irreversible loss of the Greenland or West Antarctic ice sheets, and we've actually known that for decades. We could potentially tip the Amazon rainforest into a different degraded forest or savanna state. We could tip a collapse in the great overturning circulation of the Atlantic Ocean with frightening repercussions for pretty much everybody. The point with tipping points is in any complex system, you have some shifting balance of damping feedbacks and amplifying feedbacks. A tipping point can happen when the amplification, the amplifying feedbacks within a system get so strong that they can support a self-propelling change within that system. You don't have to keep forcing a system. Change will just keep going under its own momentum.
So it's like that really simple kind of snowball analogy that once you've got enough momentum behind something, the change is unstoppable.
Yeah, I'll often just invite the audience to lean back on a chair and remind themselves that even in that very simple system, there's a point at which a small nudge, one way or the other, is going to determine your fate, whether you end up back upright or sprawled on your back on the floor. Those are two alternative stable states. And once a change starts one way or the other, it's pretty hard to stop. So the qualities of abruptness and hard to reverse, or we sometimes summarize that as irreversibility, kind of come with the territory of tipping points.
And so this idea of there being positive tipping points as well as negative ones is a relatively new idea, isn't it? So just talk us through what you mean by this idea that change can happen for the good when it comes to the climate.
Well, maybe my use coming up with that terminology of positive tipping points is new, but actually I'm drawing on like over half a century of scholarship in different fields that show that for sure you can have tipping points in social change. And we kind of know this. We're all familiar with the idea of political revolutions popping up and protests popping up seemingly out of nowhere and exploding in size. But also history teaches us that sometimes you get abrupt and hard to reverse changes in technology. It's something that's referred to in a great big text on the subject as the diffusion of innovations. But it's sort of standard thinking that there are tipping points where one new technology will take over from an existing one. Now, again, this has to be because there's strong amplification within a system. That can be just as simple as the more people who've adopted something, whether it's a new norm or behavior or technology, the more people they can infect, quote unquote, to also adopt it. So even if we're just imitating each other, you can reach a critical mass where adoption will spread out, past the tipping point and spread to the majority of the population. But on top of that, with things like technology, you have the qualities that the more we make something, the better we generally get at making it. So the more attractive it is to adopt, and the more we make it, the cheaper it gets. And that also makes it more attractive to adopt. Oh, and also with a new technology, there's a habit for innovation to create other technologies that come along and make it more useful, also making it more attractive to adopt. And that's all of those things are sometimes broadly called increasing returns by the complexity economist Brian Arthur. But yeah, we might also call them learning by doing, economies of scale, and something like technological reinforcement. And the point is, these amplifying feedbacks together can get strong enough to sometimes create a tipping point. Yeah, and that's often where there's a critical mass of people who've adopted something new is enough to trigger almost everybody else to adopt.
Yeah, like the obvious ones I'm thinking of are electric vehicles, and also just as we sat down, I saw that there's a Chinese electric vehicle firm, BYD. This BYD firm is just about to overtake Tesla sales in the UK. So that's an example of some real, it is really snowballing. Solar, of course, is so cheap now. That's really taking off. But Tim, is that the template for positive tipping points, that we kind of just have to let them or make conditions for them to be, just to sort of be taken up? Or is that how we leverage it?
Well, we have exactly the right question, and we have to think about what actions can bring forward the positive tipping point, accepting that we need to be going more than 5 times faster than we are at decarbonising the economy. And luckily there's a bunch of answers as to how each of us, whether our professions or whatever, have got not just skin in the game, but agency to do something about this. So at the most basic level, maybe we can be an adopter of a new behavior, eating less meat, or a new technology, an EV, solar panels on our roofs, whatever. We've probably also got a pension fund, many of us working people, and we should be asking hard questions about where that's invested and agitating if it's in the old fossil things and not in the new clean things. But on top of that, the story of positive tipping points that have already happened, like the fact that Norway, the car market's tipped entirely to EVs, or the great rise of offshore wind power that starts out of Denmark, or even in the UK case, the precipitous decline and shutdown of coal burning. All of these, if you trace the story back far enough, start with social activists of some kind and or innovators, the people who have a passion to develop, the core new technology, and activists who are often wanting to create change and see that possibility before everybody else. It's a great story in the Norway case because it's members of the pop band a-ha, who people as old as me will remember, and their architecture friend Harold Rosvik and their environmentalist friend Frederick Haug, who in 1989 start essentially drawing attention to the possibility of an EV tipping point in Norway, and have basically come up with 9 policy demands to the Norwegian government to try and incentivize EV uptake. So it was a long journey to the eventual tipping point, which is in about 2012 in Norway. But it's fascinating to see how, at heart, a very small group of people can ultimately trigger a phenomenal scale of change.
I noticed, I was looking at the index, and I saw Morton Harkett. What? What's he doing in here? And then I read it. It was like, oh my God.
I feel like I need to do a piece on the unlikely climate heroes.
Well, I think we should encourage 80s stars to come back and do something,
I think you should try and get Morton on the pod.
Yeah,
because
definitely.
If you've ever listened to an interview with him, you'll realise there's a dyed-in-the-wool environmentalist lurking behind a famous 80s pop singer.
And so, Tim, we've run through some of the, I guess, more obvious tipping points that perhaps are underway, hopefully, like the EV revolution, offshore wind, the end of coal power in the UK. Are there any that you see in your day-to-day life that you think, oh, we're almost there, or we're just on the cusp of real change?
Yeah, I think that diet change is a really interesting and emotive thing to appeal to Kate's favourite topic. I mean, people are very passionate, understandably, about what they eat, and it's a way in which we commune together around the table. But there's evidence in the UK and at least 7 other rich nations that overconsume meat, way over what's healthy, by the way. Excess protein consumption that's actually bad for your health. Excess meat consumption, especially red meat, can cause colorectal cancer, heart disease, diabetes, etc. In 7 or 8 rich nations, there's been a quite marked decline in meat consumption, including Britain. And I think we have all seen examples of athletes or other social influencers who are pushing particular diets, whether that's vegan or whatever, but often plant-based or low-meat diets. And we can probably all, well, some of us are old enough to remember how social norms shifted around things like smoking in restaurants. It was perfectly normal when I was a kid, and it would be abhorred now. I'm kind of looking forward to the day where the person who orders a steak in the restaurant gets everybody turning to look at them in a slight disgust, if I'm honest. Not because I'm a hardliner. I'm a kind of flexitarian myself, but I do recognise that to get anywhere near the zero emission future we need to be eating on average a lot less meat than we are. And that's a classic melting pot of kind of norm change and behaviour change.
So, Kate, we've talked a little bit about some of the negative emotions that come alongside thinking about climate change, so anger, grief and fear. But what about the impact of positive emotions and their role in inspiring action? So I'm thinking about, your chapters on love and pride, for example.
Yeah, I wanted to start the book with a positive emotion. I wanted to start with wonder, because when you take a step back, exactly like Tim said when we started out, just thinking about this planet that we live on and the fact that we understand it at all, that's incredible. And I feel like that can be both, it's true in and of itself, but it's also a really useful tool for making connections and starting conversations, right? A lot of times when I tell people I'm a climate scientist, they assume that I'm going to immediately start scolding them, right? People are like, I recycle. And I'm like, I don't care. But if you start out with kind of wonder, right? If you start out with, did you know the Earth's water is probably older than the Earth itself? It came from space. Like people are going to say, oh, how, wait, that's amazing. And they're going to be more likely to talk to you. So I think, embracing a really wide spectrum of emotions is really useful as a communication strategy. But I also think that there is support for feeling these emotions in the scientific and social scientific literature, right? So my chapter on pride begins with kind of what we would think of as hubris or arrogance, right? The fact that, oh, we can just geoengineer our way out of this. All we have to do is just block out the sun and then problem solved. And, like it's really a little bit more complicated than that. But there is a sense of pride that I think we can feel in doing the hard work, right? Exactly like Tim said, there's so much that so many of us can do to really seed this social change. And I think there is deep satisfaction in doing that work and in building that power in order to make that change. I have a whole chapter on hope, even though I have a very complicated relationship to hope. I feel like when people always ask me, oh, do you hope we can solve climate change? That for me is kind of like asking, do you hope you can clean your bathroom, right? Like, that's a silly question. You know what to do. Just go clean your bathroom. As Tim says, we have so many of the solutions we need. We are on these trajectories already. We just need to push them over the precipice. We need to get past that social tipping point. And there's so much that we can do, and we know what to do. And finally, the emotion that I ended with is love, because I think that is something that we all share, all something that we can feel for each other, for this planet. The fact that the science says how amazingly interconnected and intricate everything on this planet is, really makes you feel a part of this whole world. And then the social science literature says that love is probably the most powerful motivating factor in climate action. People are motivated to act because they love their communities, their families, love for their children, for future generations. So we know how powerful that emotion is.
How did you find the process of writing the book? I have to be honest, when I was reading some of the chapters, late at night, just before you go to sleep, I found it quite a difficult read to kind of confront head on some of the science that you're talking about. I mean, I can only imagine what it was like for you to have to go out and do the research and then write about it. Or was it quite a cathartic process?
I should put that on the cover. Quite a difficult read. I found it to be kind of a nourishing process. It's such a gift to be able to sit down and sift through the science, think about your emotions, and kind of produce something creative. The ability to do that, the time to do that is really such an incredible gift. I did find it helpful. I found it helpful to take a step back and sort of survey the scientific research literature. I found it helpful to try to talk about it in a different way, because no shade to the IPCC or the National Climate Assessment or anything. I've worked on those things, but they're kind of boring. And, thinking about, okay, how can I talk about the same science in a way that is maybe more engaging, because I am tapping into those emotions. Some chapters were really, really difficult to write. I found the fear chapter really hard to write. I found the grief chapter really hard to write because I didn't like feeling those emotions. I didn't like being stuck in those places, but it was helpful and it was honest, I think. And then, writing things like the surprise chapter, which is about the things that we still don't understand as scientists. I found that to be actually kind of fun because I feel like my job as a scientist is mostly really fun. It's really fun to find stuff out about the world.
Well, I mean, we have to face up to these emotions, don't we? Because, maybe that's one reason, apart from fossil fuel lobbying and all of that small thing, but why we haven't really got to grips with the problem. This hyper object of a problem that's too big for us to face or grapple with. So we just get on with TikTok instead.
Totally. I mean, like, I think about this stuff all day, every day, and I still don't really understand it. I still can't really fit it in my head. This is a problem that is caused by basically every industrial human activity. And because carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are well mixed in the atmosphere, it is affecting literally every aspect of life on this planet. Trying to boil that down to something very glib and manageable, I think that's just not possible. I think it is the work of a lifetime or many lifetimes to really come to terms with what this is and what this means and what we do about it.
And Tim, we touched a little bit on this idea of the amount of sway you need to push something into a over the hill and create a inflection point. And in your book, you quoted a study that I've seen before that found that campaigns only need 3.5% of active participation to succeed. And I've seen some that say, 20%, but I was struck by that 3.5%. I mean, do we not already have that for people campaigning for action on climate change?
Well, that's from the work of Erica Chenoweth, Maria Stephen. Great work. But to be specific, they're looking at instances of political change where it's not a liberal democracy situation. People are really upset by whoever's bossing the situation, right, and are trying to create not necessarily revolution, but cessation or whatever. So one must be careful not to just map the 3.5% magic figure over to Extinction Rebellion or any other part, Fridays for Future or whatever. Although the architects of Extinction Rebellion did exactly that. What's really exciting, though, is that it's the non-violent political campaigns that it would appear are almost guaranteed to succeed if they reach at least the 3.5% level. In terms of the fraction that are actively protesting on climate, I never actually totaled the numbers up, but we've certainly been in that ballpark at times. I think at the height of Fridays for Future, for example, and then things change, and in the UK we have a disgraceful situation where successive governments now are locking people up, even for threatening to do civil disobedience, for extraordinarily, extortionately long jail terms, and that must not stand. We should all be, as citizens, appalled at the clampdown on peaceful, non-violent protests on a matter of collective survival and principle. But that's just a case of what tends to happen in tipping dynamics anyway, which is the status quo, the incumbent way of doing things. Wants to keep the incumbent way of doing things, because whether they're the oil firms or the bankers or whoever, they've got a vested interest in they do well out of the status quo. And when things start to maybe destabilise a little bit, or the protests get going, they may react harder and that to try and shut things down. And I'd argue that's exactly what we're seeing in many liberal democracies now. I might be a little sad we haven't passed apparently the tipping points from the protest movement, but I take heart from the survey evidence we have that you were asked. So this is surveys of multiple countries around the world. Typically, at least 3/4 of people think that we're in a climate crisis and that governments should be acting far more urgently and decisively on it. So the silent majority is undoubtedly there, and it's well over 80% actually in quite a lot of countries.
A couple of years ago, we had Andreas Malm on the podcast, and I was just thinking of him when you were talking then, because he just posed the question of why hasn't there been violent protest about climate change? Well, and he's not condoning it, and nor am I, but he's just posing the question because in the past we have seen that in many different protest scenarios, but it's just a bit odd that we haven't seen it perhaps with climate yet. And I wondered what you made of that.
Well, I wouldn't advocate going there because, as we've already mentioned, the studies show that it's non-violent civil disobedience and direct action that is the more effective in a situation of trying to create political transformative change. Non-violent, though. If we go back to my suffragette relative, Lillian Lenton, her stated aim was to burn one building a week, and to show the then government that it was not credible to try and go on governing without the consent of half of the governed, in other words, the female half of the population. And Lillian was not alone in the suffragette movement. That was standard tactics, along with window smashing and all kinds of stuff. Having checked no one was in the building before you set fire to it, of course, but this was, of course, an archetypal example of a small and impassioned group playing a pivotal role in changing democracy for everybody. Now, as I've mentioned, unfortunately, in Britain at least, we're in a situation where the powers that be are putting draconian jail sentences on those who would peacefully and non-violently protest on climate change. And thank the whoever's for all the moves that are happening in international legal courts and to actually uphold the legal importance of us acting decisively to tackle climate change.
I wanted to ask you briefly, Tim, about the idea that maybe tipping points that can kind of get close to this threshold but then maybe peter out. You talk in your book about the school strikes for climate movement that was led by Greta Thunberg, and that happened at the same time in the UK as this wave of Extinction Rebellion protests, and then after that we saw the UK government improve its national climate target. We saw local councils declare climate emergencies. So it felt like there was kind of a wave of momentum that has now somewhat dissipated. Do you think that kind of tipping point that you talk about in your book made a meaningful difference, or was it just kind of talk without action?
I'm pretty sure it did make a meaningful difference, because you can look at survey results. If we just focused on the UK, because the data's pretty good there, you can see that among sectors of the population, particularly the older segment of the British population, they went from, like is the case in the US still, sadly, having, a half of them thinking that either climate change wasn't real or wasn't due to humans or we shouldn't worry about it, to being one of the most switched on sectors. They actually tipped, if you like, to more than 3/4 thinking that climate change is a serious issue and we should do something about it. So it did shift public understanding and perception more effectively than Kate and I and a bunch of climate scientists, but obviously leveraging off our work, but with emotion, I think, and with commitment, expressing why it mattered. The fact that the protest movements, like everything else, couldn't continue in the pandemic and so on and so forth, I don't think that's the end of the story. We are seeing in a global context a rise of what's called deliberative democracy in the academic lingo, but lots of instances where bottom-up new forms of democracy are gaining strength and power.
These are things like citizens' assemblies to come and debate.
In the UK and elsewhere, they could be indeed the climate assemblies. But if you go to Madagascar, for example, it's where communities are taking control of the spending of their own tax money and using their collective power to protest mining interests and so on and so forth that are affecting their communities. So this is never going to go away, and I think it's alive in various shapes and forms that morph over time. And that's another exciting dimension to what both of us are talking about. Because the change we need, as Kate is emphasising, it comes from the bottom up often. It comes from motivated and impassioned people who have a vision and understand and are committed and use their emotions to drive change. It really works well when the top-down governance and policy comes into alignment, and that can happen very clumsily. It doesn't have to be super well coordinated, but arguably, although I've said bad things about the situation in the UK, we still have a Climate Change Act and an independent climate commission holding the government to account, and a good net zero target. And all of that was originally born out of a private members bill that was born out of decades of environmental activism in Britain, but now is enshrined in the civil service and the workings of government. So long may it continue to try and force us towards zero emissions.
We'll gloss over what's happening in the US, shall we?
Well, again, when things are getting less stable, including that could be the fossil fuel status quo, the incumbents will fight back harder. That history teaches that, and right now teaches that. And you couldn't see a clearer example of that than what's happening in the US. But I wouldn't take that as a wholly negative signal. You've got to see the bigger systems picture, I think.
Yeah, and I was being glib, but if you look at California, it's the world's 6th biggest economy now on its own, and it's not going to stop doing, converting to solar and wind because of what's happening in Washington. So there is still hope there, Kate.
Well, do you know the state with the most wind power in the U.S. is Texas?
Right.
So, these technologies are essentially unstoppable, I think. And if you look at the polling, the percentage of Americans who dismiss climate change, say it's not a problem or not caused by humans, that has consistently been in the single digits of percentage. I think it's about 7% last time I checked. And most Americans are concerned about climate change and want the government to do something. But really interestingly, when you look at the polls, most Americans think that other Americans do not think that. And so that, I think, is why one of the most powerful things that an individual can do regarding climate change is to talk about it. Because when you talk about it, you realize, oh, maybe I'm not so much of an individual after all. Maybe I'm not alone.
Well, I was going to ask what your dream outcome for the books are, and definitely talking about this is one of them. So if you can't say that, what do you want people to do after reading your books? Kate, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would like people to read my book. I worked very hard on it. But I think, having read it, I would like people to think about, well, how do I tell climate stories that resonate with me, with my own community, with the people who will listen to me because of who I am and what I bring to the table. And that is going to be different for everybody. And that is both the most terrifying thing about climate change, is that it's going to take people from all over to solve it. But that is also one of the most hopeful things about climate change, is that it's going to take people from all over to solve it.
And Tim?
Oh, I'm hoping the readers are feeling empowered to act in what might have beforehand been feeling like a kind of very scary, kind of disempowering, this is big, it's complex, I can't cope kind of situation with all this other bad stuff we talked about going on in the world. Instead to feel, oh yeah, we've got a sense of agency, and just little me and my little community can be the start of something much bigger. Because actually that's pretty much always the way the world's been changed.
Brilliant. Well, we'll leave it there, shall we, with a sense of agency and hope. You've been listening to The World, the Universe and Us. Thanks to our guests, Kate Marvel and Tim Lenton. Their books, Human Nature and Positive Tipping Points, are out soon or out now, depending on where you live. Do go and check them out.
And thank you for listening at home. Do subscribe to our show and we'll see you next week. Bye for now.
Bye.